Speaker, Mr. Jaafar Altaie. He's the Managing Director of Manaar Energy and Consulting Project. Our speaker, he holds a degree in economics from London School of Economics and Sussex University. In 2009, and in response for the growing international interest in Iraq, Mr. Altaie has put together a Manaar Energy and Consulting Project Management in the UAE to cater for this market. Please join me to welcome Mr. Altaie to the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I'd particularly like to thank Dr. Feshiraki for another excellent event, and all of the esteemed delegates and the attendees. So there is two kinds of Iraq. There is reality Iraq and there is fairy tale Iraq. I'm going to try and talk about the real Iraq, so please try and stay awake. With me after 7 p.m., I'm ready to talk about the Iraq that we would like to see. And I think I'm going to summarize the presentation in terms of where we want to go. I will give a brief overview of the Iraqi oil industry, which many of you probably know. And then there's really three questions I want to ask and hopefully answer in this presentation. The first being, what is the strategy for IOCs in Iraq, international companies? The second is, what is the strategy for the NOCs, and then what is the government strategy? And the third is, what's the win-win, really? Because I think, I mean, there's really four premises in what we're going to discuss. The first one is that Iraq, I think, is increasing its global significance and global influence in the oil and gas industry. So it's impossible to talk about Iraq without talking about the global industry at large. I think the lessons that many of the foreign contractors have learned in Iraq are important. And those lessons sometimes point to a lack of strategy. Sometimes the lack of strategy is on the part of the Iraqi government. Sometimes the lack of strategy is on the part of the foreign contractors. And this all holds very lessons for winning strategy. What is the win-win? What does the win-win look like? We heard our esteemed Iranian deputy minister speaking earlier, and I think that for me was very encouraging because I can see Iran learning possibly lessons from Iraq and evolving a fiscal system, possibly. So I'd like to get started with those three areas. First of all, from the government strategy, the oil contractors, and when I say the oil contractors, I'm really referring to the IOCs, such as Lukoil, ExxonMobil, BP, etc. They have had to really work under very difficult circumstances. I mean, there really is no oil law today as such. There is a pending oil reforms. There are discussions of legislation. And there is disunity within various federal parts of Iraq. There is revenue sharing issues. The bureaucracy and decision-making structure is very long-winded. Anybody who worked in Iraq knows it's a very difficult and bureaucratic system to work in. And I think you can say the day I go to Baghdad airport, I feel like going home again. The minute I land on the plane and go to have my first sort of interaction with customs, I think I want to go home again. This is because the culture, the business culture, is not yet ready to absorb the private sector. You know, we went through 35 years of a very problematic dictatorship, and it's not really ready yet to understand the private sector reconcile. So this makes private investors hesitant, and it makes future investment uncertain. Having said this, I'm surprised that we are reaching the production levels we are reaching. And I'm one of the sort of diehard pessimists on the future of Iraq, but I've been pleasantly surprised in the past year or two, certainly. And here is some insight as to the issues and the complexities that we're having to deal with in Iraq. I'm not even going to try and go through this slide with you because I know that half of you will fall asleep by the time I'm finished. So this is available for your viewing pleasure or displeasure. But here, Dr. Fashraki earlier in his crystal ball pointed to the marriage analogy of the contracts. And I would say that in Iraq so far it's been a marriage of inconvenience between the various contractors and the Iraqi state. And we've even seen some divorces. But when you look at these issues, I think there is some lessons that are being learned, and we'll come to those in due course. So this is a field-by-field analysis of the liquids production or the planned plateaus. Now, it should be emphasized that in the worst-case scenario, Iraq has now reached pre-war levels of production. This is the base case. This is one of the most pessimistic forecasts of production. And already at 2014, we are at reasonable levels of production. Things could be better, but I won't say I'm very pleased with what's happened, but I'm not displeased either as to what's happened. Since we have our esteemed gentleman from Lukoil with us, I think Lukoil is one of the companies that really, to my opinion, has had a strategy in Iraq and has gone through a lot of difficulties, but really it's paying off, I think, and the progress in West Gurna now is starting to see the light of day. As you see from our rig counts, Iraq is right up there, top in terms of rigs, but there's a lot of standstill in terms of the drilling programs, the bureaucracy, and the various. Another thing is the lack of a national oil company. We don't have a national oil company in Iraq. We have a Ministry of Oil dealing with international oil companies. As anyone knows, ministry's job is a regulator. Its job is not to deal with international contractors. And this is causing a lot of problems, a lot of delays in the decision-making structure. So while we have the highest rig counts, we also have the most prolific standstills. Now that we've gone through this, let's look at the government strategy in a bit more detail. And in looking at the government strategy, we have to look at the international contractors. What is their integration models? Any government that's making its strategy looks at the integration models of its counterparts. Now, most of the IOCs are integrated, upstream and downstream. And obviously this is for optimizing the value chain, balance funding, market access. ConocoPhillips stands as one company that has disintegrated in terms of selling off its downstream interests. And this is a trend that I think is improving the bottom line results for the majority of IOCs that either are disintegrating or becoming independent specialists. So when we are formulating a strategy in Iraq, we have to look at the business models of our counterparts, be they Western oil companies or companies from East Asia. Similarly, I think companies from the GCC now are making an entrance into Iraq. By these, most notably Kuwait Energy, and this is quite a new trend now, where you're having more regionalization of companies, intra-regional cooperation. Dana Gas is obviously, as you know, in Kurdistan. So these integration models have their advantages and disadvantages when working in a place like Iraq. I think if you look at the Rumaila project, for example, there is a partnership between CNPC and BP. CNPC runs a completely different business model than BP, but in Rumaila, they have been able to find a happy medium in terms of how they interact. Lukoil previously was partnered with Statoil in West Gurna too. Again, there was some slight differences, I think, in the business culture, and the things were worked out, but Statoil pulled out for reasons beyond the constraints of that business model. So looking at enterprise value of what we call pure players versus the integrated players, we can see that the non-integrated players, the enterprise value over EBITDA ratio from between 2009 to 2013, you can see that the non-integrated players are clearly in a leading position because there is just a focus, there is a critical mass and a certain sort of degree of knowledge. Forgive me if I'm zipping through these slides, but I want to get through the discussion, and I know, I'm very conscious of time. If we look at downstream execution, total budget versus contracts executed, you can see Iraq's budget probably has the biggest discrepancy in the region. Saudi Arabia, in terms of budget versus contracts awarded, seems to have the best record, followed very closely by the UAE. And as you see, Iraq has this huge surplus of capital, and the problem is how to spend it and how to spend it wisely. And this comes back to the issue of bureaucracy. Again, now we have the wonderful prospect of elections. I think in tomorrow and the day after the polling starts. So then we have these cycles. Then we have a couple of months of government formation. Then we have Ramadan. After Ramadan is coalition formation. I predict it will be until March 2015 until a new cabinet takes shape in Iraq. Until then, I think two things will happen. The Ministry of Oil will continue business as usual for as much as possible, but it will be constrained from making strategic decisions, tactical decisions such as maintaining production, issues on seismic, issues on drilling, issues on reservoir operations will be okay, but the bigger decisions will be delayed. So I think in terms of these trends, what I really want to say is the trends that are succeeding in Iraq now are those companies that are either fully integrated or fully disintegrated. The ones that are following the classical IOC business model are finding big difficulties working in a place like Iraq because there are certain expectations from their shareholders, and the fiscal system in Iraq just simply doesn't meet these expectations. And again, we've given you quite a lot of material in terms of the integrated business models in the Middle East. I think in how it relates to Iraq is you can look at two companies, and as an Iraqi, I can give you my insight as to two companies that I will look at, and maybe three, as pointing to the right strategy in Iraq. BP, Lukoil, and CNPC. Those are the three companies I think that have understood the strategy in Iraq and have taken the risks of executing the strategy in Iraq. Another company that I think really bore and were patient with the constraints in Iraq is Shell. And I think Shell thought out of the box in terms of the integrated gas project, and they're managing now a very difficult job in Majnoon, in my opinion, a very difficult job. So there are lights at the end of the tunnel, but still the challenges remain. I want to now briefly compare Iraq with its regional counterparts. That's being Saudi Aramco, Kuwait Petroleum, and the Ministry of Oil. So you see the picture on the right is the Motiva refinery in Saudi Arabia, which is, the Motiva refinery in Port Arthur, Texas, which is owned by Aramco. And that is today the largest in the US. On the left, you see Dr. Hussein Shahristani sitting with a delegation from Sudan and discussing supply of Sudan to crude oil. This could be an Iraqi strategy. Now, Iraqi strategy could be supply the low-income markets, supply the high-risk markets, supply the markets which the conventional industry will not supply. I mean, this is Indonesia and India are two other destinations where Iraq is looking to interact with. Obviously, when you compare it to Aramco and Kuwait, and we've written here Kuwait Petroleum, I think really we're referring to the Kuwaiti group of Kuwaiti oil companies, be they KOC or KPC, and the entire sort of Kuwaiti oil industry. So you see this emerging the contrast between the strategy of the GCC NOCs and the Ministry of Oil in Iraq. Now I'd like to look at, after looking at business models and the various approaches of the contractors and the regional counterparts in Iraq, I'd like to look at the inherent risks of operating in Iraq. So I think for the refining strategy, it's important to say there has been a change of heart in Iraq. Iraq previously wanted to do a number of small refineries across the country. You know, one in Karbala, there was a plan of doing something in Najaf. There was a plan of a couple of refineries, Muthanna, Kirkuk, and those areas. Now the strategy is shifted towards larger refineries that take into consideration economies of scale and understand the domestic consumption patterns more. So I think there's a better realization of the refining fundamentals from the parts of the Iraqi government. And all of this, ladies and gentlemen, this is all a function of how the international companies are teaching and learning from the Iraqis. And I think that process is actually working to some degree. So as you see here, some data on the refineries that are being planned. One that we should really talk about is Shell Mitsubishi. Again, I think that's one of its kind. That kind of business model, you know, I haven't really seen it being replicated in Iraq. Only Shell has managed to really have this kind of vision. Looking at the downstream strategy, well, I think fuel oil is still a surplus, and persistently there is a deficit on MOGAS. New refineries might be able to correct this, but this is still an area that causes concern, I think, for the Iraqi consumption market. And then you have geography. I mean, we're a landlocked country. We don't have the access to the sea. This limits our strategic options, and then it takes us towards pipeline projects and joint initiatives with our neighbors. And the problem, as you know, in this region, whenever you have a neighborly kind of a strategy, it's always prone to politics, and depoliticization always becomes an issue. So, as we said before, 3 new refineries rather than the original 5 new refineries, and Qayyara, Misan, Basra. The report was prepared by Booz, and it was what I would call a pre-feasibility study on these refineries, which touched on some very interesting points. I think it's deficient for what is needed. I think a lot more detail is needed for the refining insight. Now, again, I think one issue that's going to delay the refineries is the mismatch between the provincial governments and the MOO. The provincial governments want one thing, and the MOO really, as a central authority, often wants something else. Infrastructure, again, I think there is a preoccupation now in Iraq for securing greater infrastructure projects in terms of the basic production facilities, the diversification of export through Jordan. Syria is, for obvious reasons, taking a back burner because obviously politics dictates. But one thing in Iraq that's striking is the regional fundamentals. For example, Kuwait is a deficit gas area, and Kuwait consumes a lot of gas and is due to consume even more gas. So sometimes the market is right underneath our nose, but some of our governments look to Europe and look further afield. But I think there's a lot to be said for regional gas trading projects, and the infrastructure requirements of those projects is a lot more realistic. So I've wanted to give you an overview because I want to leave as much time as possible for discussion. And I want to end on talking about some winning strategies for Iraq. And I'm going to give you two pieces of the equation. Here is the Chinese, or our interpretation of the Chinese business model. What the Chinese companies do on the upstream side is they bundle everything into a single entity. So seismic, drilling, facilities, reservoir, pipelines, ancillary is all bundled under one company or under one commercial group. The price is known. When they go and do an upstream project, they can budget. Their OPEX and CAPEX are accurately forecasted. There is fast progress, which for the Ministry of Oil is very important. Cheaper, fewer subcontractors. There is variable quality when it comes to Chinese work. Sometimes Chinese companies perform exceptionally well, and they become part of the whole, I mean, they become another ethnic group in their own right. In Iraq, with the amount of workers also they bringing into the country. That has a negative impact in terms of job creation, but has a positive impact in terms of getting the job done quickly with variable results. And they're very flexible. They can work under a very tight fiscal system, which no Western IOC would touch with a barge pole. So in Iraq, for example, CMPC under BGP and under other contractors can do seismic, 3D, 2D, 3D seismic. They have companies that can do well drilling, logging, surface testing operations, operations management, etc. In contrast, you see the Western IOC model. And the Western IOC model subcontracts all of these ancillary services. And when you are at the beginning of bidding a project, those costs are unknown. They're unknown because, this is all subcontracted. Of course, the flip side is the work standard is more consistent. And the work standard, you know what you're going to get, but the price and the cost is an obvious upside or downside, depending on which side of the table you are. If you're on the Iraqi government, it's a downside. If you're on the side of the contractor, if you're on the Iraqi government, it's an upside. If you're on the other side, it's a disadvantage. So the Western IOCs have integrated asset teams, but they still outsource. And they provide specialized services. There's more efficiency, and I think in the case of Lukoil specifically, Lukoil for me has a very unique strategy in Iraq. It's a strategy based on a very deep understanding of Iraq, I think. I would almost say some type of patient, gradual, piecemeal approach. When other IOCs really get frustrated very quickly by the lack of progress, I have noticed Lukoil number one, understands, and number two, makes an effort to negotiate to negotiate its position realistically. So I don't know where Lukoil will fit in these two sort of. If I look at the Chinese model and then I look at the IOC model, I think Lukoil more or less fits in here. But I will leave that for you to decide. So I want to conclude. You might be happy to hear. So I think largely successful program in Iraq. I think 60% of the production target has been achieved since 2010. But this was the easy fields. The difficult fields still are eluding us. The areas what has joint geography with Iran, for example, the areas where there are still landmines, the areas where there are more difficult geology and geophysics, those are the next challenge for us. So when we talk about increasing production, we have to discuss, are we ready to take on the technical challenges that await us for the more difficult fields? I think the challenges are politics also. And when I say politics, I mean geopolitics and oil politics. Of course, geopolitics is, we don't know. We have to defer back to the crystal ball again to know what geopolitics is going to bring. Oil politics, I think you need a Ministry of Oil that is more enlightened. You need a national oil company, and you need a more private sector friendly business culture in the government. I predict 60% will continue to be achieved. That will tail off towards 50 and 40% as we near 2017 to 2018 because the challenges will get more. I see major changes in the current policy after the 2014 elections. The Ministry of Oil will change. I do see the evolution of a national oil company. But pretty much I see year-on-year production growth, but modest production growth. And I think the Iraqis have to tone down their expectations. And I think they will learn the hard way, but they have to learn. One word of OPEC, I think there is a good agreement within OPEC. I'm one who says that OPEC has been very sympathetic with Iraq, has been very understanding about Iraq's issue. And I think OPEC doesn't want a confrontation with Iraq, and I don't think Iraq wants a confrontation with OPEC. I think this is a bargaining process, and I think OPEC will eventually understand, number one, Iraq has production constraints. It will not reach its plateau production anyway. And number two, I think OPEC wants to accommodate all its members. So I see some good, reasonable agreement and consensus from OPEC. Let's talk finally about Kurdistan. I think Kurdistan is a very prolific area of Iraq. The downside is Kurdistan is very saturated. The good stuff is gone, really. The good stuff is taken. And I think what you'll see in Kurdistan is more acquisition, M&A, or purchase of existing operators there. Also, I predict Kurdistan will be 60% successful in achieving its production targets. Gas exports to Turkey are mired in politics, and they're mired in local politics. Kurdistan has to balance between its relationship with Ankara and its relationship with Baghdad, and possibly its future relationship with Iran. So it has a very, very difficult balancing act. So to sum up, I think Iraq is still the major hub of opportunity in the region, by far the biggest E&P market in the region. I think on the downside, Iraq has disappointed many of its international contractors. On the upside, Iraq continues to learn, and hopefully with the participation of companies like Shell, Lukoil, and CNPC and BP, we will prosper into a key regional and global oil and gas player. Thank you very much.